Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift quietly out of the neat, buttoned up world that people like to imagine when they think of late Victorian life. Not the world of lace curtains and moral pamphlets and earnest hymns sung with a straight face, but the one that was always there, breathing calmly behind the wallpaper, politely waiting for everyone to stop pretending so we'll move nice and slow into the years after Victoria, when the public voice kept insisting on decency and the private habits kept insisting on something else entirely. And everyone, in their own tired way, tried to hold both realities at once without dropping either. When Queen Victoria died in 1901, a certain kind of public theater ended with her. Not because the habits vanished. Habits rarely vanish, they just change costumes. The old queen had spent decades being turned into a symbol, like a living moral monument. She was made to represent steadiness, family virtue, domestic piety, and the idea that the British Empire was basically a large, well managed household with good curtains and a strict bedtime. Meanwhile, the empire itself ran on ports, cash crops, soldiers, shipping lanes, and a very large number of men who were nowhere near their wives for long stretches of time, which is an arrangement that never in the history of humanity has produced calm romantic restraint. It produces loneliness, it produces boredom, it produces drinking, it produces very reliably a thriving economy of paid intimacy, mostly run by people who had fewer choices than the men buying it. So even in Victoria's lifetime, decency was often an expensive hat worn on top of a very different head. But her long reign gave that hat a kind of weight. People were used to it. They even liked it in the way people like a familiar, slightly uncomfortable chair. It pinches you, but it's yours. Then the chair got swapped out. Enter her son. Edward VII had waited so long to be king that by the time it finally happened, he was already an older man, thick around the middle, fond of food, fond of company, fond of being adored, and not remotely interested in pretending he was a moral monument. Victoria had spent most of his life treating him like a disappointing houseplant. He couldn't do anything right. He ate wrong, talked wrong, socialized wrong. He was always wrong, and she was always right, and the empire was always watching. So when he became king, the release was noticeable. It wasn't that he introduced vice into public life. Vice did not need an introduction. It had already been living there, paying rent. But he did introduce a different kind of atmosphere, a more relaxed one, a more openly indulgent one. He turned the court into something warmer, more social, more openly pleasure loving, which is a gentle way of saying he made it easier for influential men to behave exactly as they already wanted to. Edward's personal life had been messy for decades. He had married Alexandra of Denmark, who was beautiful, dutiful, and by most accounts, emotionally stranded in a marriage where her husband's affections wandered constantly. He loved her in his way, but his way included a steady parade of mistresses, because of course it did. He was the heir to the throne in a society where men like him were raised to believe the world was arranged for their appetites. And appetites, as history keeps demonstrating, are rarely polite. They do not respect vows. They do not respect wives. They barely respect breakfast. There were rules, though. There are always rules. The rule was not be faithful. The rule was be discreet. And discreet did not mean kind. It meant quiet. It meant keep the machine running without embarrassing anyone important. In the late 19th century, the growth of big cities, the movement of rural populations into industrial work, the anonymity of urban streets, and the sheer volume of transient male labor all made commercial intimacy more visible and more organized. Brothels, in various forms, had existed for centuries, but the modern city gave them scale. it gave them neighborhoods, it gave them networks. It also gave the authorities a problem. How do you police morality in a place where you can't even recognize your neighbors? The answer very often was that you didn't police morality evenly. You policed it selectively, like a bored man trimming a hedge into a shape he likes, even if the roots underneath are doing whatever they want. In Britain, prostitution wasn't exactly legal in a clean, straightforward way, but it wasn't eradicated either. It existed in a limbo of tolerated necessity and periodic crackdowns. The police would target street workers more aggressively than high end establishments because one was visible and inconvenient, and the other served people who could write letters to the right newspapers. It was an elegant system. By elegant, I mean cruel and predictable. Meanwhile, continental Europe had a different approach in many places. Regulation. The idea was to treat prostitution as an inevitable fact, like sewage, and manage it with inspections, licensing, and medical surveillance. It sounded practical. In practice, it usually meant the women were monitored and punished while the men were treated as blameless consumers of a service, which is a strangely flattering way to describe the spread of disease and the purchase of power. And all of this Britain's hypocrisy, Europe's regulation, the empire's long distance loneliness was happening under the soft glow of public moral language. Newspapers and preachers spoke about purity. Parliament debated decency. Meanwhile, the streets, the docks, the barracks, the music halls, and the private clubs kept generating the same business. What changed after the Victorian era wasn't the existence of brothels, it was the tempo, the mood, the confidence, the sense that the old queen's shadow had finally moved and the world could exhale. And it wasn't just Britain. Across Europe, monarchies were in a late stage condition that could be described as ornate exhaustion. The crowns were still there, the palaces were still there, the ceremonies still ran on schedule. But underneath, family lines were tangled, bodies were fragile, and emotions were not handled well. This is where the royal dysfunction really comes in. Because if you want to understand why this era produced such an intense mixture of public propriety and private chaos, you have to understand that Europe's elite families were, at this point, basically one extended intermarried network of anxious cousins. They had been marrying each other for centuries to keep property and alliances neatly bundled. They told themselves it was strategy. Sometimes it was, but over time it also became habit, a tradition, a kind of social claustrophobia. Because when you only ever marry within a small circle, you don't just concentrate wealth, you concentrate everything: temperaments, illnesses, genetic weaknesses, family grudges. That one uncle everyone avoids, the awkward silences, the inherited tendency toward emotional collapse when stressed, which, inconveniently, is the baseline condition of being royal in an era where the public expects you to be a symbol, not a human. They produced heirs who were expected to embody national strength while quietly struggling with chronic illness, anxiety, depression, addiction, or just the general spiritual fatigue of being raised like a decorative object. And when those heirs grew up, many of them did what bored, over-controlled people often do. They sought outlets, pleasure, danger, affairs, a sense of control over something, anything, in lives that were otherwise scripted. High-end brothels catered to that exact need. They offered not only sex, but the illusion of choice, the illusion of privacy, the illusion of being a man, not a symbol. It's not a noble illusion, but it's a powerful one. People will pay a lot for an illusion that makes them feel less trapped. In London, the West End and certain discreet addresses became known, quietly and without official acknowledgement, as places where wealthy men could buy what they wanted. There were madams who ran their establishments with careful professionalism, because professionalism is what you need when your clientele includes men who can destroy you with a whisper. There were also men who treated these places like private playgrounds, because when you're rich enough, consequences become a rumor. And the same pattern repeated across European capitals. Paris, Vienna, Berlin, Brussels, each had its own system, its own codes, its own famous addresses. Some brothels were grim, crowded, and desperate. Others were luxurious, staged like theaters, with mirrors, velvet, perfumes, and the careful performance of pleasure. The more expensive the place, the more it sold, not the act itself, but the fantasy that no one was suffering. Of course, someone always was. Now, if you want royal weirdness, you don't have to look far. Consider the fact that many monarchs and heirs were raised with almost no emotional education. They were trained to stand, bow, smile, and marry the correct person. They were not trained to process rejection, loneliness, or desire. So when those feelings arrived, and they always arrived, they hit like weather in an open field. Edward VII's own household set a tone. His friendships, his social gatherings, his ease with mistresses, his reliance on pleasure as a form of comfort, these were noticed and copied. Not because he invented them, but because he made them feel less shameful for the elite. And Alexandra, his queen, became another kind of symbol, the dignified, wounded wife who did her duty and maintained her silence. She had her own complicated inner life, her own losses, her own grief. She lost a son, the young Prince Albert Victor, in 1892, a blow that left the family shaken. Albert Victor had been the heir after his father, and his death pushed his younger brother George into the role. History does this all the time, gently and without apology. It removes one person, and the entire future shifts sideways. Albert Victor himself was a strange figure in the public imagination. There were rumors, there were scandals, whispered and inflated. Some linked him probably unfairly to the world of London's sexual undercurrents, because the public loves nothing more than imagining that a handsome prince is secretly roaming the darker streets. It makes the monarchy feel more like a novel. And people always want the monarchy to be a novel, because reality is often too bland. But whether or not Albert Victor had any direct involvement with those rumors, the fact that such stories could attach to him tells you something important. The era was already primed to believe that royal men were slipping into the city's hidden economies, because it was plausible, because it fit the pattern, because everyone knew the rules of discretion and everyone knew the rules were constantly broken. When George V became king in 1910, after Edward's death, the atmosphere shifted again. George was more restrained, more routine bound, more comfortable in uniforms than in drawing room flirtation. He and his wife Mary were the kind of couple who treated duty like a religion. They were not dreamy. They were not romantic. They were efficient, like well-made furniture. But even a dutiful monarchy cannot control the broader society it sits on top of. And the early 20th century was a society in motion. The city kept growing. Entertainment kept expanding. Music halls, theaters, cheap novels, postcards, photographs all fed a public appetite for erotic suggestion wrapped in plausible deniability. You could always claim it was art or humor or continental sophistication, and everyone could keep their moral hat on while secretly enjoying the show. At the same time, the empire and the military continued to generate massive male populations living away from home. Soldiers, sailors, dock workers, railwaymen, clerks, living in boarding houses, men with wages in their pockets and no domestic supervision. Again, this is not a setup that produces chastity, it produces commerce. Brothels became part of the informal infrastructure of urban life, like pubs and laundries. They were places where loneliness and desire could be turned into money. And because money was involved, class was involved, there were hierarchies, as there always are. A wealthy man might visit a luxurious establishment with champagne and silk curtains. A poor man might find a woman on the street and take his chances with violence, disease, and arrest. The police, meanwhile, continued their selective trimming. Street workers were easy targets. Brothel keepers could be raided when politicians needed to look moral. But the deeper engine of demand was rarely addressed, because addressing it would mean addressing male behavior, and that was always going to be inconvenient. And then, slowly, the world walked into the First World War, which, among its many talents, had a special ability to take existing social patterns and intensify them until they cracked. War meant millions of men moved through camps, trenches, ports, and foreign cities. It meant long separations, fear, trauma, boredom between terror and sudden bursts of pay. It meant entire populations living under pressure and uncertainty. It meant women moving into new kinds of work, new kinds of visibility, new kinds of vulnerability. And it meant that the business of sex, already thriving, adapted to wartime conditions like it always does, because it is, in a grim way, one of the most flexible economies on earth. Military authorities across different countries worried constantly about venereal disease, because disease reduces fighting strength, and fighting strength is the only moral value a military bureaucracy truly respects. So they oscillated between crackdowns and regulation. Some tried to suppress prostitution near camps. Others quietly tolerated or managed it, because suppression rarely works when the demand is that strong and the men are that restless. The irony, of course, was that the same societies sending men to die for civilization were also struggling to handle the very ordinary human needs those men carried with them. Civilization is always a slightly fragile performance. Royal families watched all of this from their palaces and hospitals and military visits, trying to appear steady, but inside their own walls, dysfunction continued, as it tends to do when your family is both a private unit and a public institution. George V and Mary had children, and like so many royal parents, they raised them with a mixture of affection and emotional distance. They believed in discipline, they believed in duty, they believed strongly in not making a fuss, which is an excellent way to produce adults who are very good at making a fuss later in private when no one can stop them. Their eldest son, Edward, the Prince of Wales, grew up charming, restless, and hungry for affection. He was adored by crowds, photographed constantly, treated like a celebrity before the word existed in its modern sense. He smiled, shook hands, wore uniforms, toured the empire, and learned the addictive pleasure of being wanted by strangers. It's a strange drug, public adoration. It can make you feel powerful and empty at the same time. And when you grow up with emotionally reserved parents, you learn to chase warmth wherever you can find it. Edward's private life, even in his youth, leaned toward relationships that gave him emotional intensity, not stability. And the circles he moved in, aristocratic, fashionable, wealthy, were exactly the circles where discreet affairs and paid intimacy overlapped, because the upper classes did not live in a separate universe from brothels. They simply had better curtains and more expensive lies. In Paris during the post-war years, for instance, high society mixed with artists, writers, dancers, and wealthy tourists, and the line between respectable and not respectable became increasingly decorative. Berlin in the 1920s became famous for its nightlife, its cabarets, its sexual openness, its sense that the old moral world had been bombed into dust and people might as well dance on what was left. And London, even with its stiff upper lip, was not immune. The city had its own nightlife, its own private clubs, its own whisper networks. The difference was that London liked to pretend it wasn't happening, which only made it more intriguing because repression has always been a clever marketing strategy. Meanwhile, royal marriages across Europe continued to be arranged or encouraged in ways that often ignored compatibility, emotional health, or basic human happiness. The goal was continuity, alliances, the production of heirs. Love was optional, fidelity was negotiable, personal fulfillment was not really on the list. This is where you start to see the generational trauma stacking up like old luggage. A prince raised without tenderness becomes a king who cannot offer tenderness. A princess raised to endure becomes a queen who endures until she breaks quietly inside. Children grow up watching cold marriages and learning that affection is either dangerous or purchased. And purchased affection, whether through mistresses or brothels, has a particular hollow taste. It can soothe you for an evening, but it doesn't build anything lasting. It's comfort food for the soul, and like most comfort food, it leaves you hungry again later. Edward, Prince of Wales, moved through the interwar years as a symbol of modern glamour, but his emotional life was increasingly tangled. He had affairs with married women, older women, women who offered him a sense of being cared for, which was, for him, a kind of forbidden luxury. Some of these relationships were discreet, others were not. And because he was who he was, discretion was always going to be complicated. At the same time, brothels and commercial sex adapted to the new era of mass media. Photographs, films, popular magazines' desire was being packaged and sold in new ways. The sex industry has always been sensitive to technology and culture because it is built on attention, and attention is shaped by whatever new medium people are staring at. And the law, as usual, lagged behind reality, stumbling along, trying to look in control. Campaigns against immorality rose and fell. Scandals erupted, were whispered about, then smoothed over. The public learned to live with contradiction. They demanded moral leadership while consuming immoral entertainment. They scolded women while excusing men. They punished the visible while protecting the powerful. History, once again, choosing chaos, but doing it in a very polite accent. In the background of all this, Europe's royal families were still cousins, marrying cousins, still producing children under pressure, still managing illnesses and emotional instability behind palace walls. The Russian Romanovs had already collapsed into revolution and tragedy, a reminder that crowns could fall, and fall hard. Other monarchies watched nervously, pretending they were immune, the way people pretend they won't get sick if they don't talk about sickness. Britain's monarchy survived, partly because it adapted, partly because it was wrapped in tradition, and partly because it was very good at letting other people take the blame for national problems. But survival did not mean harmony. George V's children carried the weight of expectation like damp wool. Edward carried it by running from it, chasing romance and validation. His brother Albert, shy and anxious, carried it like a burden he never asked for. Their sister Mary carried it with grim competence. Their younger brothers found their own ways to cope, some healthier than others, some not. And in the wider society, the post-war world kept shifting. Women had tasted new independence through wartime labor. Some wanted more. Men returned from war changed, traumatized, restless, sometimes unable to fit back into domestic life. Marriage patterns shifted. Divorce became more visible. Moral panic flared because moral panic always flares when people feel control slipping. And whenever societies panic about morality, they tend to focus on sex because sex is the easiest battlefield. It's intimate, it's symbolic, it's easy to blame. It's also inconveniently something people keep doing no matter how many sermons are delivered. So reformers campaigned against prostitution. They spoke about saving women, often without asking what women actually needed, which was usually money, safety, housing, and the ability to live without being exploited. Meanwhile, the demand remained. Men kept buying. The police kept arresting the easiest targets. The courts kept processing cases like factory work. And the upscale establishments, the ones that served wealthy clients, often continued behind discreet doors because wealth has always been the best form of camouflage. By the time George V died in 1936, the monarchy passed to Edward VIII, and the entire emotional mess he'd been cultivating finally collided with the institution. He wanted to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee, a woman who was worldly, sharp, and to the royal establishment unacceptable. Not because she was evil, but because she broke the script. She had been married before, twice, eventually. She did not fit the fantasy of royal purity, that old hat the monarchy still needed to wear in public. Edward, of course, thought this was a good idea. He thought love, or what he called love, should override duty. And in a human sense, maybe it should have, but monarchies are not built for human senses. They are built for continuity and symbolism and the careful maintenance of illusion. So the crisis came. The government refused, the church refused, the establishment refused, newspapers tried to manage the information, the public murmured, and Edward, who had spent his life being adored, discovered that the institution did not exist to adore him. It existed to use him. He abdicated quietly but not gently. And in doing so, he handed the crown to his brother Albert, who became George VI, a man who had never wanted it, who struggled with anxiety and a stammer, and who now had to carry the weight his brother had dropped like an unwanted package. The abdication, in its own way, was a kind of royal scandal that echoed the broader themes of the era. Desire versus duty, private longing versus public expectation, the emotional instability produced by rigid upbringing, and the way institutions punish people for being inconveniently human. And while the monarchy tried to recover its dignity, the broader world kept turning. The interwar years were full of economic strain, political extremism, and social unrest. And in that atmosphere, the sex industry did what it always does. It adjusted, it survived, it expanded in some places, it went underground in others. It fed on desperation and loneliness and the human tendency to seek comfort in the simplest ways available. In some cities, brothels became entangled with organized crime. In others, they became part of nightlife tourism. In others, they were targeted by moral campaigns that pushed them into more dangerous conditions. The pattern repeated. Suppressing visible prostitution rarely eliminated it. It just made it more precarious. And royal families, even as they tried to project stability, continued to be filled with fragile bodies and fragile minds. The British royal line, like many European lines, carried the long-term effects of intermarriage, not always in obvious physical deformities, but in the clustering of certain conditions, the repetition of certain temperaments, the same emotional patterns echoing from parent to child. You see it in the way affection is rationed. You see it in the way duty is used as a substitute for intimacy. You see it in the way public ceremony becomes a mask for private loneliness. George VI, with his wife Elizabeth, tried to build a warmer image. Elizabeth was lively, supportive, emotionally present in a way Mary had not been. She understood instinctively that the monarchy needed not only dignity but charm. And George VI, for all his anxiety, had a stubborn sense of responsibility. He did the job because it had to be done, not because it thrilled him. Their daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, grew up in a world that was about to be reshaped by another war. And war, again, would intensify everything: separation, loneliness, the movement of troops, the strain on marriages, the vulnerability of women, the demand for comfort. And so, as Europe slid toward the Second World War, the old patterns of commercial sex, already well established, were poised to surge again under the pressures of mass mobilization. Soldiers would march, cities would fill with uniforms, blackout curtains would fall, and behind those curtains, people would still be people, tired and frightened and wanting warmth, and the businesses built to sell warmth would keep their doors open quietly, efficiently, and with the same old blend of glamour and despair, because even in the middle of history's grand political disasters, someone always needs to pay rent, and someone always needs to forget themselves for an hour, and someone always needs to pretend that pleasure can be separated from consequence. And in a narrow street not far from a train station, a woman would wait beneath a dim lamp, listening for footsteps, wondering whether the next man would be kind or cruel, because the kindness was never guaranteed, and the cruelty was always cheaply available, and the city, with its endless appetite, kept swallowing one small life after another while the newspapers continued to print speeches about honor, and the palaces continued to shine in the distance, and the men who made the rules continued to break them, and somewhere behind a respectable front door, a madam would count the evening's earnings and think, with a tired practicality, that tomorrow would be much the same unless the police decided they needed a headline, or unless a drunken officer decided he was entitled to more than he paid for, or unless the bombs started falling sooner than anyone expected. And in that uneasy pause between one disaster and the next, the world kept moving forward, slow and stubborn, and the old Victorian hat of morality sat slightly crooked on everyone's head, still insisting, in its quiet, ridiculous way, that everything was under control, even as the streets below continued to hum with the steady, unromantic business of desire, and the royal family, tucked into their traditions and their silences, carried on producing heirs who would grow up surrounded by ceremony and starving for ordinary affection, heirs who would learn, as so many had learned before them, that if love was hard to find in the palace, it could always be purchased elsewhere if one was willing to ignore what that purchase cost. And one young aristocrat, barely out of school, would be led by older friends into a discreet house with heavy curtains and soft carpets, feeling both nervous and entitled, because entitlement was taught early, and inside the air would smell faintly of perfume and coal smoke, and a woman with a practiced smile would step forward and take his coat, and he would feel, for a brief moment, like he had stepped out of duty and into something that belonged only to him, and the illusion would settle around his shoulders like a borrowed robe, and he would follow her down a hallway lit by low lamps, trying not to think about how quiet it was, trying not to think about how rehearsed the warmth felt, trying not to think about how this, too, was part of the same old inheritance passed down through generations of men who could not bear to sit alone with their own thoughts. And as the door at the end of the corridor opened and the lamplight spilled softly across the carpet, he swallowed and tried to smile. And the woman, still calm, still professional, still unreadable, reached out her hand and said in a voice as smooth as the drapes along the wall that it would be all right, that it was simpler than he thought, that he only needed to step inside. And he did, because of course he did, and because history, with its endless patience for human weakness, had seen this entrance 1,000 times before and would see it 1,000 times again. And the corridor behind him, with its muffled sounds and heavy air, seemed to close in as if the house itself was quietly breathing. And somewhere outside, beyond the curtains and the careful discretion, the city kept its steady rhythm, horses and cars and footsteps moving through the night, while inside, the next small transaction began, measured in coins and sighs, and the quiet, practiced surrender of pretending that anything here was truly private, or truly new, or truly free. And the young man, who would one day sit at a table with powerful men and speak solemnly about duty and honor, let himself believe for one drifting hour that he was simply a body seeking comfort and not an heir to anything at all. And the woman, who had learned long ago not to believe in the promises men make when they are lonely, watched him with the same careful attention she offered every client, and thought, without bitterness and without hope, that he looked very young to be so sure the world owed him tenderness. And she guided him further into the room, speaking softly, letting the rehearsed gentleness do its work, while the lamp on the bedside table flickered slightly, as if even the flame was tired of watching the same old human pattern repeat itself in rooms like this, night after night, generation after generation, until the sound of distant sirens began to drift in from somewhere far away, faint at first, then clearer, and the city's ordinary hum shifted, almost imperceptibly, as people paused to listen, and the young man hesitated, his head turning slightly toward the window, as if some part of him still belonged to the outside world, still capable of hearing danger before it arrived. And the woman, her hand still on his sleeve, listened too, her expression unchanged, because she had lived long enough to know that danger always arrived eventually, whether by uniform, by poverty, by disease, or by war. And the sirens, growing louder now, threaded themselves through the night air like a warning no one could quite afford to obey. And she spoke again, quieter this time, telling him there was nothing to worry about, that it was probably a drill, that the authorities liked drills, that the authorities always liked drills, because drills let them feel competent. And he nodded, wanting to believe her, wanting to stay in the illusion just a little longer, wanting to pretend that the world outside could be postponed. And as the sirens swelled and the first distant thud of anti-aircraft guns began to pulse somewhere beyond the river, the lamp continued its small flicker, and the room, with its soft curtains and staged comfort, held its breath. And in that held breath, there was the strange, quiet intersection of private vice and public catastrophe, of purchased intimacy and national emergency, and neither could cancel the other, neither could erase the fact that people kept seeking warmth even as the sky prepared to break open, and the young man, still halfway between boyhood and the hard mask of adulthood, took another step forward, because stopping would mean thinking, and thinking was the one luxury he had never been taught to tolerate. And the woman, steady as ever, closed the door behind them, letting the muffled sound of the outside world fade just enough that he could keep pretending, just enough that the illusion could survive, at least until the next explosion shook the glass and the dust fell softly from the ceiling like a tired gray snowfall, and he flinched, and she sighed very quietly, as if to say that even the heavens were determined to interrupt men at the exact moment they tried to forget what they were. And she reached out again, guiding him toward the bed, speaking in that same calm tone, telling him that sometimes the world was loud, that sometimes it was cruel, that sometimes it did not care what people wanted, and that tonight was simply another night, another transaction, another small attempt to buy peace in a time when peace was increasingly expensive, and as the guns outside kept their slow, rhythmic thunder, the room settled into its familiar routine, and the young man, eyes half lidded now with a mixture of fear and desire and exhaustion, let himself sink into the scripted comfort while the woman watched the ceiling for a moment, listening to the war arrive one distant udar at a time, and wondered, not for the first time, how many kings and soldiers and fathers and sons would pass through rooms like this before the world finally learned that no amount of moral hats or royal speeches could ever fully silence the restless hunger that kept pulling people again and again into the dimly lit corridors of the night, where the price of forgetting was always counted carefully and always paid by someone who could least afford it. And as she turned back to him, her voice low and even, she asked him his name, not because she needed it, but because men like to be asked. Men like to feel seen. And he told her, softly, and the name meant nothing to her beyond the sound of it, and yet it carried with it an entire line of inheritance, an entire web of cousins and titles and expectations. And she thought, with the same dry practicality she used for everything, that names were heavy things to carry into a room like this. And he laughed nervously, trying to make it a joke, trying to make the moment feel ordinary. And she gave him the small smile she had practiced for years. And outside, the city kept shaking under the first real pressure of war, while inside, in a room staged for secrecy, the old cycle continued, steady and unglamorous, and the young man leaned closer, whispering something half romantic and half desperate, and she listened as if it mattered, because in her profession, listening was sometimes more valuable than touch. And as the night deepened and the air grew warmer with the closeness of two bodies trying to forget the world, the sirens began to fade into the distance, replaced by the softer sounds of the house settling, and the young man's breathing slowed, and for a moment he seemed almost peaceful, as if he had found what he was looking for, and she watched him with a calm expression that did not reveal the thought passing through her mind, the thought that peace brought this way never lasted. It only delayed the return of whatever ache had driven him here in the first place. And sooner or later he would step back into his tailored life and carry that ache with him again, dressed up in duty, pressed flat under respectability, until it pushed him back toward another doorway, another curtain, another woman with a practiced smile, because the world had raised him to believe that comfort was his right and raised her to believe that comfort was her product, and the distance between those two beliefs was where the real damage lived, quiet and persistent. And as the lamp finally steadied and the room grew still, she reached over to adjust the blanket, a small, almost maternal gesture, and she wondered, in that tired way that comes when you have watched too many men repeat the same pattern, whether any of them ever truly understood what they were buying, or whether they only understood that the palace was cold and the streets were wide and the night was long, and that somewhere behind heavy curtains someone would always be waiting to sell them the illusion that they were loved. And in the hush that followed the distant gunfire, she listened to his breath and thought about how the world outside would look in the morning, and how quickly the newspapers would turn last night's bombing into neat lines of print, and how quickly men in offices would speak about courage and sacrifice, and how quickly the city would return to its routines, and how quickly the next lonely man would knock at the door, because the boom in these hidden houses was not really a boom of pleasure, it was a boom of need, swelling whenever society strained, expanding whenever the old structures cracked, and the cracks were spreading now, slowly, patiently, across the whole continent, and even the royal families, perched in their palaces, could feel the tremor, could feel the way history was shifting under their feet, and yet they kept doing what they had always done, marrying, producing heirs, posing for photographs. Speaking of stability, while their private lives remained tangled and hungry and quietly desperate. And in a different palace, far from this small room, a princess would lie awake under embroidered sheets, listening to the same distant guns, wondering why love felt like something everyone talked about but no one seemed to have, wondering why her marriage felt like a duty performed for strangers, wondering why her husband's gaze drifted away from her so easily, and why the air between them felt colder than the stone walls. And she would think, not without a sting of irony, that the world expected her to embody virtue, while the men around her slipped out into the night to buy their comforts elsewhere, and she would swallow the bitterness, because swallowing bitterness was part of her training, and the bitterness would settle quietly in her chest, becoming another small stone in the pile of stones that royal women carried, generation after generation, until their faces hardened and their laughter thinned and their eyes learned to look past the people in front of them. And somewhere in that same palace, her husband would sit in the smoking room with other men, speaking in low voices about politics and war, laughing a little too loudly at a joke that wasn't very funny, and someone would mention a discreet address in the city, and the men would exchange glances that carried more understanding than they ever offered their wives. And one of them would say, with casual certainty, that it was necessary, that a man had needs, that it was better this way, that it kept things orderly. And another would nod, because nodding was easier than examining what he was actually doing. And the first man would stand, buttoning his jacket, smoothing his cuffs, preparing to step back into the night, because the night, for men like him, was full of doors that opened and consequences that stayed politely outside. And as he reached for his hat, always the hat, always the public mask, he would not think about the woman waiting in the palace bed or the woman waiting behind the brothel curtain, not as fully human people, but as roles in his life, roles designed to keep him comfortable. And the world, with its tired old habits, would continue to spin, slow and steady, carrying him forward into the darkness where the lamps burned low and the curtains hung heavy, and the same quiet bargains were made again and again and again, until even he began to feel, somewhere beneath the layers of entitlement and routine, the faint unease that no amount of purchased warmth could quite silence, the unease that the whole system of crowns, of duties, of moral hats, of secret doors was beginning to feel less like tradition and more like a trap, and he would pause on the palace steps for a moment, hearing the distant echo of the city, smelling the cold air, and he would tell himself, as men so often do, that he deserved a little comfort, that he had earned it, that the world was difficult, that the war was stressful, that duty was heavy, and that this one small indulgence meant nothing at all. And then he would walk toward his waiting car, because once a man has learned to excuse himself, he can excuse almost anything. And the driver would open the door, and he would step inside, and the car would roll out into the dim streets, carrying him toward another quiet doorway where someone would be paid to pretend that his loneliness was special, and the city lights would slide past the window like slow-moving stars, and he would lean back, closing his eyes, letting the motion lull him, and in that half-drowsy state he would almost forget, just for a moment, that he was part of the same old royal machine that had been grinding on for centuries, chewing up wives and mistresses and illegitimate children and whispered scandals, chewing up the bodies of the poor in wars fought for flags and pride, chewing up the souls of the privileged in rooms filled with silence. And as the car turned a corner and slowed, and the driver said they had arrived, he opened his eyes again, and the familiar mixture of anticipation and emptiness returned, settling into place as neatly as his gloves, and he stepped out into the night, and the door behind him clicked shut, and the narrow street smelled faintly of damp stone and cigarette smoke, and he approached the entrance with the calm confidence of a man who believed that the world, even in wartime, would always make space for his desires, and he knocked and waited, and in the pause before the door opened, he listened to the soft quiet of the street, and he thought, without quite knowing why, of the word duty, and how strange it was that duty always seemed to demand sacrifice from everyone except the men who spoke its name most often, and the door opened and warm air spilled out, carrying perfume and candle wax, and a woman's voice greeted him softly, and he stepped inside, letting the darkness swallow him, and the door closed again, and the street returned to silence, and inside, the same old corridor stretched forward, lit by low lamps, waiting patiently, as if it had been waiting for him all his life, and he walked on, slower now, because the warmth always made him slow down, made him feel as if time could be bent around his comfort, and he did not notice, or chose not to notice, the faint tremor in the walls, the subtle way the world outside was becoming less stable, the way history was gathering itself for another shift, the way the old systems were beginning to strain, because noticing would require him to feel something he had been trained to avoid, and so he kept walking, following the woman deeper into the house, deeper into the illusion, while above them, somewhere in the dark sky, the engines of aircraft hummed like distant bees, and the continent, exhausted and restless, prepared to remake itself yet again, and in the quiet rooms, where pleasure was bought and sold, people carried on with their small rituals as if the end of an era could be delayed by keeping the lamps low and the curtains drawn, and the woman leading him glanced back for a moment, her expression unreadable, and she thought, with the same calm sarcasm she never allowed to reach her face, that men like this always believed the world would wait, and the world, cruelly indifferent, almost never did, and she opened the next door, and the warm light inside fell across his face, softening his features, making him look briefly almost harmless, and he stepped forward, and the illusion settled around him again, and the night moved on, and the quiet bargains continued, and somewhere far away in another palace, another marriage cooled, another child listened to parents speaking in clipped voices, another generation absorbed the lesson that love was conditional and comfort was purchased, and the whole tired inheritance pressed forward through time, slow and unbroken, like a long, drowsy procession through candlelit corridors, where the walls remembered everything and the people remembered almost nothing. And in the room, as he sat down and loosened his collar, he began to talk, as men often did in moments like this, about how difficult everything was, about how much pressure he was under, about how no one understood him, and the woman listened, nodding gently, because listening was part of the transaction, and as he spoke, his voice grew softer and his eyes grew heavier, and he seemed for a moment like a child confessing fears to a stranger. And the irony of it, this powerful man seeking tenderness in a place built on exploitation, hung quietly in the air, unnoticed by him, noticed by her. And as he finally fell silent, she reached for the small glass on the table, poured him a drink, and handed it over, watching as he took it with the casual entitlement of someone who had never had to ask twice for what he wanted. And he drank and sighed and leaned back, and the lamp beside him cast a soft glow over the room, and the shadows along the curtains looked almost gentle, almost kind, and outside the aircraft engines grew louder, and the first distant udar of another wave of bombing rolled across the city like a slow drum beat, and he closed his eyes again as if he could shut the war out by simply not looking at it, and she watched him and thought quietly that this was what the so-called respectable world really looked like when you peeled back the lace in the sermons, not heroic, not noble, just tired men hiding from themselves, and women paid to make the hiding feel comfortable. And as the walls trembled faintly with the udar of explosions far away, she set the glass down gently and reached toward him, and in the soft, steady hush of the room, she began again, repeating the same calm words she had said 1,000 times. Words designed to soothe, to slow, to make him feel safe. And he listened, and his breathing eased, and the world outside continued to crack. And inside, the old routine held on, stubbornly, as if routine itself could serve as a shield against the truth that no amount of money, no amount of discretion, no amount of royal entitlement could ever fully control what history did next. And in the quiet pause between one explosion and the next, he murmured something about how things would return to normal soon, because men like him always believed in normal, the way children believe in bedtime stories. And she did not contradict him, because contradiction was not part of what he was paying for, and because she had learned that men often needed their illusions more than they needed honesty. And so she let him drift, let his words fade, let the room's warmth do its work, while outside the night deepened and the city, half lit and half hidden under wartime darkness, kept breathing, and the long, tangled era after Victoria, full of moral hats, royal dysfunction, quiet bargains, and the steady boom of hidden houses continued to unfold in the dim glow of lamplight, one tired human desire at a time. And as he shifted closer, his hand reaching out with a tentative confidence, she guided it gently, steering the moment the way she always did, keeping control in the only ways she was allowed. And in that small act of guidance, there was a strange kind of power, quiet and practical. And she held on to it because it was hers, and because in a world built to take everything from women like her, even small power was something worth keeping. And he leaned in, whispering again, his voice thick with drink and loneliness. And she listened, and the lamp flickered once more, and the curtain rustled faintly as another udar rolled through the distance. And in that soft rustle, in that soft flicker, the night carried on, unbroken, indifferent, and endlessly familiar. And she thought, as she always thought when men began to confuse comfort with meaning, that tomorrow he would put his hat back on and walk out into daylight pretending nothing had happened, and she would remain here behind the curtain, waiting for the next knock and the next and the next, until the day the war finally reached this street directly, and the whole fragile house of illusion collapsed into dust. And even then, she suspected men would still be looking for somewhere warm to hide, and she would still be expected to provide it, because expectation was the one thing society never ran out of. And as he finally felt quiet again, his forehead resting briefly against her shoulder as if he belonged there, she stared past him at the wall, listening to the slow rhythm of the guns outside, and she wondered, not with hope, but with a kind of sleepy resignation, whether any generation ever truly escaped its own inherited patterns, or whether they simply redecorated the rooms and called it progress. And in the half darkness, with the Vostok heavy and warm, she moved her hand slowly, smoothing the fabric of his sleeve, and he sighed. And the sound was so ordinary, so small, that it almost seemed ridiculous that empires and wars and crowns could exist at all, when human life, at its core, still came down to this same tired search for comfort, and the search continued, quietly, as the night wore on and the lamplight held steady, and the corridor outside waited in silence, ready to swallow the next set of footsteps whenever they came. And in the city beyond, the old moral language kept being spoken in public rooms, while in private rooms like this one, the truth kept unfolding in whispers, and the whispers drifted into the dark and disappeared, and the world turned on, slow and relentless, carrying everyone with it, whether they wanted to go or not. And as the woman shifted slightly, adjusting the blanket again, she heard another faint knock at the front door of the house, And she paused, listening, knowing that someone else had arrived early, someone else who needed to buy forgetfulness before the night was over. And she let out a soft breath, almost a sigh, and she told the man beside her, in the same calm voice, that she would be back in just a moment. And she stood, smoothing her dress, stepping quietly toward the door. And as she opened it, the corridor's low lamps stretched out before her, and she walked down it with the steady patience of someone who knew exactly what the night would demand. And at the far end, the front door opened, and a new figure stepped inside, shaking off the hollered air, and she looked up and recognized him as one of the king's household men, a familiar face from palace functions, a man who smiled politely in daylight and pretended he did not know her, and he smiled now too, a little strained, and he said, in a low voice that tried to sound casual, that he hoped she had room, and she answered just as casually that there was always room, and he laughed under his breath because of course there was, and he handed over his coat, and as she took it, her fingers brushing the fabric, she noticed the faint scent of cigar smoke and Dorogoy cologne, and she thought, with that same tired sarcasm she kept buried deep, that the palace always smelled like money and denial, and she led him inward, away from the door, away from the street, away from the world that would never admit this corridor existed, and behind them the front door closed softly, sealing the night's quiet commerce inside once again, and she walked on, her shaggy slow, and even her voice low, asking him how his Vicha had been, and he answered with a few careless words about stress and duty and Naprogenia, words that meant nothing because they were always the same. And as they moved deeper into the house, the distant guns outside continued their slow rhythm, and the corridor's lamps burned steadily, and she thought, with a calm certainty that made her almost sleepy, that whatever changed in the world king's abdicating, wars starting, empires trembling this part of the city would keep repeating itself until something truly broke it, and even then it would probably rebuild somewhere else, because Chilevich's hunger always found a new address. And as she reached the next door and lifted her hand to open it, she heard him murmur, almost shyly, that he didn't want anything Slishcom strange tonight, just something quiet, something märke, something that made him forget. And she nodded, because forgetting was the main product here. And she opened the door, and the warm light spilled out, and he stepped forward, and she followed, closing the door behind them, and the corridor was left empty again, waiting patiently for the next footsteps and the next quiet knock, and the next tired man who believed that paying for tenderness made it safer. And inside the room, as the lamplight fell softly across the carpet, the household man loosened his collar and exhaled, and she watched him with the same calm attention, thinking that even servants of the crown carried the same loneliness, just dressed in cheaper fabric, and he looked up at her, and for a moment his eyes held a flicker of something like shame, and then it passed, smoothed over by Privichka, and he gave her a small smile that tried to be charming, and she returned a small smile that tried to be kind, and in the quiet air between them, the old bargain settled into place again, as familiar as the curtains and as neespezhny as the voina outside, and she stepped closer, her voice soft and even, asking him what he wanted, and he hesitated, as if the vapose itself was too intimate, as if wanting was harder to admit than buying, and finally he said, quietly, that he wanted to feel like a person for a little while, not a function, not a uniform, not a shadow in someone else's grand life. And she listened and nodded because she understood that feeling too well, and she reached out, taking his hand gently, guiding him toward the chair, and he let himself be guided, surrendering to the comfort the room promised, and outside, somewhere beyond the blackout curtains, The city's notes continued to pulse with distant thunder, and the era continued to unfold, slow and continuous, without ceremony, without neat endings, just one Chilavirchiska need sliding into the next. And the household man sat down, and she stood beside him, and he began to speak again, low and tired, about how the king looked older lately, about how the queen tried to ulabatsa, but her eyes with siktat tense, about how the princesses were growing up too fast, about how everyone pretended the bombs were just weather. And as he spoke, his voice softened further, and she listened, because listening was what she did, and because in that listening there was a strange, quiet intimacy that sometimes felt more real than the act itself. And he looked at her as if she might be the only person in the world who wasn't asking him to perform, and the irony of that finding honesty in a room built on pretending hung softly in the air, and she reached out to touch his shoulder, not dramatically, not passionately, just gently, the way you might touch someone who was slishkum tired to hold themselves up. And he closed his eyes, and his dihania eased, and the room grew quieter, and the lamplight held steady, and in that steady light, the whole complicated post Victorian world seemed to settle into its true shape. Public morale stitched tightly like a corset, private desire slipping around the seams, royal families wobbling under the weight of their own expectations, and ordinary people caught underneath, paying the price in small Yezhednevnia ways. And as the household man leaned back, his head resting against the chair, he murmured almost to himself that none of it made sense anymore, and she answered softly that it never really had. And he gave a faint laugh, because even in exhaustion, the truth could still feel like a small joke. And she stood there, calm and steady, holding the night together for one more client, one more hour, while history kept moving forward outside, slow and unstoppable. And in the distance, the guns continued. And in the palace, the king continued. And in the streets, the quiet boom continued. And in the warm room, the household man opened his eyes again, looked up at her, and asked, in a voice that tried to sound light but couldn't quite manage it, whether she thought the world would ever go back to the way it was. And she paused just long enough that the pause itself became an answer. And then she said, softly, that the world always changed, that it never really went back, that people only pretended it did, because pretending made the nudge feel less hollered. And he nodded slowly, absorbing that. And as he reached for her hand again, the lamplight flickered, and for a moment the shadows on the wall looked like moving figures, like ghosts of all the men who had come before him, all the men who had sat in rooms like this, believing they were escaping their lives, when really they were just carrying their lives into a different room. And he squeezed her fingers gently, and she squeezed back, and the night continued, unbroken, as he leaned forward and began to speak again, quieter now, telling her about the Ruska war he overheard at the palace, about ministers arguing, about fear hidden under polite words, about the strainer fragility of power. And as he talked, his voice became a low murmur, and the murmur blended with the distant guns, and the whole world seemed, for a sleepy moment, to move at the same slow pace. And she listened and thought with a tired certainty that even if kings fell and wars ended, there would always be another generation of men raised to believe in entitlement, another generation of women forced to turn survival into a performance, and another corridor lit by low lamps, waiting patiently for footsteps. And as the household man's words drifted into silence, his eyes closing again, she leaned closer, her voice almost a whisper, and she said that he could rest for a while, that he didn't have to think, that thinking could wait. And he nodded, letting himself sink into the Merker chair, and the room grew quieter. And in that quiet, the city outside seemed almost distant, as if the world's Razrushania could be held at bay by nothing more than a warm lamp and a zakrita door, and the illusion, fragile and familiar, settled over them again, and the household man breathed out slowly, and in the soft hush he murmured one last thing, half asleep, half awake, that he wished he had been born ordinary, and she answered, so quietly he might not even have heard it, that ordinary was just another kind of tajist. And then she sat beside him, waiting, listening to his breath, listening to the distant thunder, listening to the house Tichia creaks. And as the minutes drifted by, slow and uncounted, the corridor outside remained empty, and the lamps remained low, and history continued its steady movement forward, carrying with it kings and servants and gentian behind curtains, carrying with it the lingering zapach of perfume and smoke, carrying with it the quiet boom that had grown in the shadow of morality, and in that slow movement the household man shifted slightly, his head turning, his lips parting, as if to say something else, and she leaned in, ready to listen again, because listening was what kept the night moving, and because the night, like history itself, never really stopped. It only changed rooms, and in the murky light he whispered, almost inaudibly, that he had heard rumors about a certain officer, a man close to Vajnia people, a man who had been seen too often in certain streets, and he said the officer had a taste for danger, for secrecy, for girls barely old enough to know what they were doing, and the woman's expression did not change because surprise was a luxury here, and she only asked softly, what sort of rumors? And he swallowed, his eyes still closed, and he said the rumors were that the officer had paid Horosho for silence, that he had left more than money behind, that he had left bruises, that he had left fear, and that the Politzer, when they heard whispers, had suddenly become ocean busy elsewhere. And as he murmured this, the woman's hand tightened slightly on the edge of her skirt, a small motion, almost invisible, and the lamp flickered again, and the shadows on the wall seemed to deepen, and the distant guns outside kept a slow rhythm, and in the hush between one udar and the next, she asked, still calm, still low, what the officer's name was, and the household man hesitated, as if even here, even in this room, names could be dangerous. And then, very softly, he said it was someone the newspapers would never print, someone the palace would never admit to knowing, someone who ulabalsa in daylight and spoke of duty and honor. And then, with a quiet breath that sounded like resignation, he finally let the name slip out into the room, and the woman listened, and for a moment the silence that followed felt heavier than the voina outside, heavier than the starry curtains, heavier than the privichni illusi, because names, as she had thought earlier, were heavy things, and some names could crush you if you held them too long, and she sat there, still, letting the name settle in her mind, and she thought, with a dry, almost sleepy bitterness, that of course it would be someone like that, because it was always someone like that, and the household man's breathing slowed again, his confession drifting away as he slipped back toward sleep, and she remained awake, staring at the lamplight, thinking about how many doors in this city opened for men with the right names, and how few doors ever opened for the women who had to live with what those names did. And as she sat there in the quiet, the house creaked softly, the corridor lamps burned low, and somewhere at the front door another faint knock began, hesitant at first, then steadier, and she rose slowly, smoothing her dress again, her dvizhenia unhurried, because the night always demanded patience, and she walked toward the corridor, her shagi murky on the carpet, and the knock came again. And as she reached the front door and placed her hand on the handle, she took one quiet breath, steadying herself the way she always did, and she opened the door, and the cold air spilled in, and a figura stood there in the dim light, hat pulled low, face partly hidden, and for a moment she could not tell whether he was another lonely chinovnik, another tired soldier, or someone far more dangerous. And the figure lifted his head slightly, and she saw just enough of his features to recognize that this was not a man who came here for comfort alone. This was a man who came because he liked the power of being unseen, and he stepped forward without waiting to be invited. And she stepped back instinctively, her calm smile forming automatically. But the automatism was sometimes the only sashito she had. And the man's voice, low and smooth, said that he had been told she could be trusted, and she answered, still calm, that trust was expensive here. And he laughed quietly, as if he appreciated the joke, and as he removed his gloves, one finger at a time, his eyes scanning the corridor, the lamps, the Zakritia doors, he said that he had money, and she believed him, because men like this always did. And he said he also had questions, and as he stepped further into the house, letting the door Zakritsa behind him, the warmth swallowed the hollowed air, and the woman realized, with the same tired certainty she had felt so many times before, that the night was about to become more complicated than routine, and in the murky lamplight the man's smile settled into place like another mask, and he asked her, softly, whether she had heard any interesting rumors lately, and she held her expression steady, because expressions were dangerous things here, and she answered carefully that rumors were everywhere in wartime, that people whispered all kinds of things to feel important, and the man nodded, as if patient, as if amused, and he stepped closer, and his voice dropped even lower as he said that some rumors were not meant for everyone, and that he was very good at deciding who should hear what. And the woman felt, beneath her spokojna surface, the familiar hollowed thread of fear, the kind that ran through every transaction in this world, the kind that reminded you that doors could open both ways. And as the man reached out, not to touch her, but to touch the wall beside her, leaning in as if the corridor itself belonged to him, he said again, softly, that he had been told she could be trusted, and the woman, still holding her calm smile, thought, with a dry neutrony sarcasm, that being trusted by men like this was usually the beginning of a very long problem, and she drew a quiet breath, preparing to answer, preparing to steer the Razgovor the way she steered everything, because steering was survival. And she said, in the same low professional tone she used for lonely men and frightened men and entitled men alike, that she could listen, that she could be discreet, that discretion was what this house sold. And the man smiled, satisfied, and he said that was good, because he needed discretion tonight more than comfort. And as he spoke, the distant guns outside seemed, for a moment, to pause, leaving a strandy hush over the city, a hush in which his next words landed softly, almost lazily, as he asked her whether she knew anything about a young girl who had disappeared from a street not far from here, a girl whose name he did not say yet, as if savoring it. And the woman felt the corridor's air grow heavier, and she kept her face smooth, because faces were the first thing men read, and she answered quietly that many girls disappeared in the city, especially now. And the man's smile did not fade, it only sharpened slightly, and he said, yes, but this one mattered to someone powerful, and power, as you know, had a way of making even ordinary Chesnavinia suddenly interesting, and he tilted his head, watching her, waiting, and the woman, still calm, still steady, realized that tonight, once again, the cost of all these quiet bargains was about to be paid in something more than money. And she began to speak, choosing her words carefully, because the wrong word could bring the palace down on her, the police down on her, or something worse. and she said that she had heard nothing certain, only whispers, only the usual Trivornia stories, and the man nodded slowly, as if he expected that answer, and he said that was all right, that he had time, that the night was long, that people always talked eventually, and as he said this, he reached into his coat and produced a small envelope, thick with notes, and he held it out, letting it hover between them like a promise and a threat. And the woman looked at it and then looked back at his face, and she thought, with a sleepy bitterness that felt almost like a privichka, that the world always found new ways to turn women into currency. And as she reached out to take the envelope, her fingers brushing the paper, the man's hand lingered just a moment too long, not touching her skin, but close enough that the Namerinier was obvious. And he whispered softly that he would be back, that he expected her to remember whatever she needed to remember by then. And she nodded, because nodding was often the safest answer. And the man smiled again, satisfied, and he turned, walking back toward the front door as if he owned the corridor, as if he owned the night, as if he owned the secrets that lived in houses like this. And as he opened the door, the hollowed air spilled in again, and for a moment the distant guns outside resumed their slow thunder, rolling across the city like a reminder that war was the only force that did not care about discretion. And the man stepped out into the street, pulling his hat low once more, and the door closed behind him, leaving the woman standing in the corridor with the envelope in her hand, the lamps burning low, and the ticky weight of his question settling into her mind. And she stood there for a long moment, listening to the house's soft creaks, listening to the muffled sounds of the rooms behind the doors, listening to the city's distant thunder, and she thought about the name the household man had whispered earlier, and about the man who had just left, and about how the palace's shining image was built, brick by brick, on the silence of people like her. And she thought, with that same drive, neutrony humor that kept her from breaking, that if the world truly wanted morality, it had chosen a very strange way to arrange it. And she turned slowly, walking back down the corridor, her steps soft, her face composed, carrying the envelope like a small Tijoli stone. And as she approached the room where the household man sat half asleep, she paused at the door, her hand on the handle. And she wondered, not with hope, but with a tired practicality, how many more names the night was going to demand from her before it was done. And she opened the door, stepping back into the warm light, and the household man lifted his head, blinking, and asked softly who that had been. And she hesitated just a fraction of a second too long, and then she said calmly that it was just another man looking for something. And the household man frowned, as if sensing the lie's shape, and he asked what kind of something. And the woman sat down slowly, placing the envelope on the table, and she said quietly that in this city men were always looking for something they didn't want to admit they had lost. And the household man stared at her for a moment, and then he looked away. But the mushta looking away was what people did when they suspected the truth but didn't want to carry it. And outside, the distant guns continued their slow rhythm, and inside, the lamp burned low, and the woman reached out to pour another drink, her movements steady, her voice soft, as she began to speak again, choosing her words like careful steps in a corridor where every door led to another kind of risk. And she said that the palace was not as far away from streets like this as people like to pretend. And the household man swallowed, his eyes tijolier with tiredness, and he whispered, almost to himself, that he knew, that he had always known. And the woman nodded. And in the quiet that followed, the truth sat between them like a third person in the room, silent and tijoli. And she thought, as she listened to the night outside, that the era after Victoria had promised modernity and progress, but it had only made the old hypocrisies faster, larger, and more profitable. And as the household man leaned back again, his dihania slow, she stared at the envelope on the table, and she wondered what would happen when the wrong whisper finally reached the wrong ear, and whether the people in palaces would be forced, even briefly, to see the corridors their power created. And she sat there, calm and still, listening, waiting, as the night continued to unfold, slow and unbroken, and the household man, half asleep now, murmured one more thing, barely audible, that the king's people were afraid of scandal more than they were afraid of bombs, and the woman let out a tichy breath that might have been a laugh, because that sounded exactly right, and she reached for the lamp's wick, turning it down slightly, letting the light soften, letting the shadows deepen, as if the room itself wanted to drift into sleep. And as she did, the envelope's edge caught the light for a moment, bright and sharp, and then the light faded again, and the room settled into a hush, and the woman sat back, her hands folded loosely in her lap, her face composed, and she listened to the slow rhythm of the war outside and the slower rhythm of Chelovechska weakness inside, and she thought, with a tired certainty, that no matter how many times history changed its costumes, it always seemed to return to the same quiet rooms, the same tihir bargains, the same names whispered like prayers or threats, and as the household man's breathing deepened, slipping fully into sleep, she remained awake, staring at the curtain, and in her mind she heard the man's question again about the Chesnovshire girl, about the rumor that mattered to someone powerful, and she felt, beneath her calm surface, the old familiar panimania that in a world built on discretion, the most dangerous thing you could ever have was knowledge, and she sat there holding that knowledge like a Tajoli stone, while the lamplight burned low and the night continued, and somewhere beyond the walls the city kept moving, and the palace kept shining, and the quiet boom kept growing, and the woman, still calm, still steady, waited for the next knock, because it would come. It always came. And when it came, she would stand, smooth her dress, and open the door, because that was what survival looked like in the linear shadow of royalty and war, and because in the end, the corridor did not belong to kings or ministry or officers. It belonged to the Noach itself. And the Noach, patient and indifferent, always demanded to be fed, and as she listened to the distant guns fade for a moment into a softer hush, she heard, faintly, the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside, slow and measured, and she turned her head toward the door, her eyes narrowing slightly, and she wondered, with a quiet, weary fatigue, whether someone had entered the house again without knocking, whether the man who had left had returned sooner than a Beshana, or whether it was simply one of the girls moving between rooms, and as the footsteps drew closer, the lamp flickered once, and the handle of the door began to turn, very slowly, as if whoever was outside wanted to be quiet, wanted to be unseen, and the woman held her breath just for a moment, listening, and the door opened a crack, and a litzo appeared in the narrow gap, and she recognized it instantly, not from the streets, but from the palace, from the Offizialne functions where he smiled in daylight and spoke of duty, and in that Magnavenia, with the lamp burning low and the war outside murmuring like distant thunder, she realized that the name whispered earlier had not been just a rumor at all, because the man standing there, slipping into the room with practiced ease, was the same one whose Ulipka appeared in newspapers beside speeches about honor, and he closed the door behind him softly and turned toward her, and his voice, smooth and familiar, said that he hoped he wasn't slishkum late, because he had had a long day of pretending, and now he wanted something real. And as he stepped closer, the lamplight caught the edge of his cufflink, bright for a moment like a Malinki star, And the woman kept her face calm because calm was her armor. And she answered softly that Rio was not something this house sold. And he laughed quietly, as if amused by the idea, and said that people always said that, and yet they always came. And he reached into his pocket, pulling out another envelope, heavier than the last, and set it down on the table beside the first. And the two envelopes sat there like twin Dokasatelsdwa of the same old system, and the household man slept on, unaware, breathing slow, and the woman looked at the officer's face in the dim light, and she thought, with a dry, neutriny humor so tired it almost felt like peace, that history really did have a talent for sending the same disaster through the same door again and again until someone finally stopped opening it and the officer tilted his head, watching her, and asked softly whether she had heard any interesting whispers tonight, and she held his gaze, still calm, still steady, and she began to speak carefully, because the words she chose now could decide who lived comfortably and who vanished quietly. And outside, beyond the blackout curtains, the city breathed in the dark, waiting for the next Udar. And inside, in the warm lamplight, the officer's smile remained perfectly composed as he said that he preferred honesty and that he had a great deal of patience, and that patience, like everything else in this world, could be bought. And the woman, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table, felt the weight of both envelopes, and the weight of the name, and the weight of the disappeared girl, and she answered softly that honesty was also expensive, and that she hoped he had brought enough, and he smiled wider at that, because he liked the sound of bargaining. He liked the sound of control, and he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice further as he said that he had brought more than money, that he had brought protection, and that protection in wartime was the rarest luxury of all. And the woman listened and nodded once, slowly, because slow was safe, and she said quietly that she would tell him what she knew, but only if he promised to keep her name out of it. And he laughed under his breath, as if the promise was already implied. And he said, of course, because names were dangerous, and he understood dangerous things very well. And as he spoke, his hand reached out, not toward her this time, but toward the lamp, turning it down just a fraction more, letting the room grow dimmer, letting the shadows thicken. And in that dimness, his face looked less like a man and more like a mask, smooth and unreadable. And he said softly that in the palace they had been discussing how to manage certain Nepriatny issues, how to keep the public calm, how to keep the moral hat from slipping too far. And he said that sometimes to keep a hat in place, you had to press down hard. And the woman listened, and in her mind she saw again the vanished girl, not as a rumor, not as a politichesky inconvenience, but as a child who had once walked down a street believing she might have a future, and she felt beneath her calm surface a slow, tiki anger begin to stir, not garachi, not dramatic, just steady, the way the tide moves. And she kept her voice soft as she began to tell him what she had heard, what she had seen, what she had guessed, from the way men whispered and paid and threatened, and the officer listened, his expression still composed, still faintly amused, as if the Sudby of girls was simply another administrative detail. And as she spoke, the household man shifted in his sleep, murmuring something unintelligible. And the woman continued, her words low and careful, describing a street, a time, a face glimpsed in lamplight, a carriage seen turning too quickly, and the officer's eyes narrowed slightly, the first real crack in his mask, and he asked her to repeat one detail, just one, and she did. And as she did, the officer's smile returned, smaller now, sharper, and he said softly that this was very useful, that she had done well, that he appreciated loyalty, and the woman, still calm, thought with dry, Nudriny sarcasm that loyalty was always a lovely word when spoken by someone who never offered it in return. And the officer reached for the envelopes, pushing them toward her, and he said she would be rewarded, that she would be safe, that she should not worry, and the woman nodded again, because nodding was often the only way to keep breathing, and the officer stood, smoothing his cuffs, preparing to leave. And as he turned toward the door, he paused, looking back at her with a spokojner, almost friendly expression, and he said softly that if she ever heard any other whispers, she should remember who her friends were. And then he opened the door and stepped into the corridor, his footsteps tichir, measured, disappearing down the lamplit hallway, and the woman sat in the dim room, listening as the sound of his steps faded, and she realized, with a slow, hollowed clarity, that nothing she had just done was going to protect the vanished girl, or the next one, or the next. It was only going to protect the palace's illusion, and the illusion, as always, would be kept intact by sacrificing the most disposable people first. And she stared at the envelopes on the table, and the money inside them suddenly felt less like Spasinia and more like a stain. And she leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment, letting the tiredness wash over her. And in that tiredness, she felt the weight of the era itself, the whole linear stretch after Victoria, where morality and vice had danced together so closely that no one could tell which was leading. And she opened her eyes again, looking at the sleeping household man, and she wondered quietly whether he would wake and remember what he had told her, whether he would regret it, whether regret even mattered in a world that ran on silence. And outside, the distant guns continued, and in the palace, speeches would be made, and in the streets, girls would be shazat, and in the tichia houses, behind heavy curtains, the business would continue, because business always continued. And the woman sat there, calm and still, holding the envelopes, holding the knowledge, holding the quiet ponimania that the true lady of royalty was not just crowns and ceremonies, but the long shadow of entitlement stretching into the darkest rooms of the city. And as the lamp flickered one last time, she reached out, slowly, and slid one envelope into her drawer, then paused with the other in her hand, hesitating, because for the first time in a long time she felt the stranaya, dangerous urge to do something that was not privichka, something that might change the pattern. And she sat there, the envelope held between her fingers, while the noche outside breathed, and the corridor lamps burned low, and her mind began to turn over the possibilities, slow and careful, like someone touching the edge of a knife to see if it was sharp. And she whispered, almost inaudibly, not a prayer, not a plan, just a tired thought to herself, that sometimes the only way to survive a system was to let it choke on its own secrets. And she looked toward the door, listening again, because footsteps could return at any moment. And as she listened, the household man stirred, his eyes opening slightly, and he looked at her with a groggy confusion, and he asked softly if everything was all right. And she smiled, small and calm, and she said yes, of course, because saying no would change everything. And the household man nodded, sinking back into sleep, trusting her without knowing why. And the woman sat in the dim light, envelope still in hand, thinking about names, thinking about power, thinking about Ishesnavania, and the night continued unbroken as she finally began to move, slowly, quietly, toward the Malinki desk in the corner, where she kept bumaga and ink for the practical running of the house. And she sat down, dipping the pen, and for a long moment she did nothing, just held the pen above the paper, listening to the distant guns, listening to the house, listening to her own breath, and then, with a slow steadiness that surprised even her, she began to write a name, not her own, not the girl's, but the officer's, carefully, clearly, because clarity was a weapon too. And as the ink sank into the paper, dark and permanent, she felt the strange, quiet shift of a Privichka breaking just slightly, just enough to let the different future slip in, and she wrote another line beneath it, an address, a time, a detail, and as she wrote, she imagined the paper leaving this room, leaving this house, leaving this corridor, moving into a world where it might become dangerous to the men who had always relied on silence. And she did not feel triumphant. She felt only tired, because tiredness was what you felt when you finally admitted that the world was exactly as bad as you had always suspected. And when she finished the final line, she laid the pen aside, the lamplight trembling faintly over the fresh ink, and she leaned back to study the page, understanding that the most difficult part was not writing at all, but deciding where it should go, because the city was crowded with hands willing to exchange one secret for another, crowded with authorities who would silence it, with reporters who would distort it, with officials who would weaponize it, and she needed a recipient who would not turn her small attempt into someone else's gain. And as she sat there, thinking carefully, her thoughts drifted to a name she had once heard, a quiet reformer, a woman who worked to protect missing girls, who kept careful records, who spoke plainly in ways that unsettled powerful men, and that thought settled in her mind like a steady lamp. And she reached for an envelope, an ordinary one, and slipped the paper inside, folding it with care. While the household slept, the corridor waited, the war murmured in the distance, and the long post Victorian world continued onward. And in one modest room, a woman who was expected to self forgetfulness prepared instead to release a memory into daylight. And as she sealed the envelope, pressing the flap down with her thumb, she heard another knock at the front door, faint but insistent, and she paused, envelope in hand, listening, aware that the night did not pause for private choices, that it always demanded the next exchange. And she rose slowly, smoothing her dress out of habit, because habit still had power. And she slipped the sealed envelope into the inner pocket of her bodice, close to her skin and heartbeat, where it felt warm and dangerous. And then she returned to the corridor, her steps even, her face composed, and she reached the door, set her hand on the handle, and opened it. And a man stood there in the dim light, younger than most, rain in his hair, uncertainty wide in his eyes, looking at her as though she might save him or undo him. And she offered the small professional smile and asked gently what he sought. And he swallowed and said, barely audibly, that he had been told this was the place where one could forget. And she nodded, because that was what people believed. And she stepped aside to let him in, letting the warmth close around him as the door shut. And as she took his coat and felt the envelope against her chest, she thought with weary irony that forgetting was always available. But remembering was what might finally bring the elegant disaster down, and she guided him along the corridor, speaking softly, asking simple questions meant to calm, and he answered in fragments, his fear plain, his wants tangled with unease, and she listened, leading him forward as the lamps burned low and the hallway stretched on. And when they reached the first door, she paused, her hand on the handle, aware again of the envelope's weight, wondering how long it would take to reach the light and whether the light would truly change anything or merely show, as it often did, that the world preferred darkness because it was easier for those who profited from it. And she opened the door and ushered him inside. And as warm light spilled out the corridor, fell silent once more, waiting, patient. And the woman stepped ahead, steady and composed, carrying both the habit of her work and the risky spark of her decision. And the night went on, unbroken, as she spoke quietly to the young man, telling him he could sit, that there was no hurry, that the outside world could wait, and he nodded, relieved. And as he sat, she turned slightly toward the curtain, listening for footsteps, for authority, for the city and the distant war. And in that listening, she felt not hope exactly, but something like direction, a thin line drawn through routine. And when he looked up at her with searching eyes, she gave him the same gentle smile she had given so many others and asked his name. And he told her softly, and it was an ordinary name, unmarked by titles or headlines, and she thought with quiet sadness how easily ordinary names disappeared, and she took his hand with care, and for a moment the distant gun seemed to fade, replaced by a softer hush, and in that hush the city itself appeared to listen, as if history were holding its breath, waiting to see whether this one small act of remembering would matter at all. And the woman, still holding the young man's hand, began to speak in her low, even tone, guiding him into the warm routine of the room, while inside her bodice the sealed envelope rested like a small chivoy thing. And as the minutes drifted by, slow and uncounted, she felt the envelope's presence with every breath, and she knew that once she had carried it out of this house, once she had placed it into someone else's hands, there would be no taking it back, no returning to the Prajna or Dobna darkness. And the thought did not frighten her as much as she expected, because fear was something she had lived with so long it had become familiar, almost dull, and sometimes the dullness itself was what allowed you to do something dangerous. And as the young man's breathing slowed, his nervousness easing, she continued her soft razgovor, letting the room's warmth do its work, while in the corridor outside, footsteps moved again, faint and measured, approaching, and she did not look toward the door yet. She kept her face calm, kept her voice even, because whatever was coming down that corridor would come whether she looked or not, and the footsteps drew closer, and the handle began to turn, and she finally shifted her gaze, just slightly, toward the door as it started to open, and in the narrow crack of darkness she saw the outline of a familiar hat, the edge of a familiar uniform, and she felt the envelope press against her chest as if reminding her that she was no longer only a Pradavets of forgetfulness, she was now also a carrier of something far more dangerous. And the door opened wider, and the officer stepped in, his face smooth, his smile perfectly composed, and he said softly that he had forgotten to ask her one more thing, and the woman kept her hand on the young man's, kept her voice calm as she answered, gently, that he would have to wait his turn, because tonight the house was busy, and the officer's smile tightened just slightly, the smallest snack that he did not like being told to wait, and he glanced at the young man, then back at her, and his eyes, sharp even in the dim light, seemed to linger for a moment on the line of her bodice, as if he could sense the presence of the sealed envelope hidden there. And the woman held her calm smile steady, because if he sensed it, the night would become very short indeed. And she said again, softly, that he could wait outside, and the officer's eyes narrowed a fraction, and he stepped closer, his voice dropping lower as he said that waiting was not something he enjoyed, and the woman's smile did not change, but inside her mind, slow and clear, she began to count the steps to the corridor, to the front door, to the street, to the place where she could slip out with the envelope before he realized what she had done. And as she counted, the officer's hand lifted slightly as if he might reach for her, and the young man beside her stiffened, sensing the shift, and the room's warm wasdog seemed to thicken, and outside, somewhere beyond the blackout curtains, the distant guns began again, their slow thunder rolling back into the night, and the woman, still calm, still steady, looked up at the officer and said very softly that the war had made everyone impatient, but that impatience did not change the prattle of the house. And the officer's smile held for another moment, thin as paper, and then he let out a quiet laugh, a sound with no warmth in it at all. And he said, "Of course, how foolish of him." And he stepped back toward the door, lifting his hands in a teatral gesture of surrender. And the woman watched him, her seerza steady, her face composed. And as he reached the doorway, he paused again, looking back, and his voice, still low and smooth, said that he would see her later, and that he hoped she remembered who was keeping her safe. And the woman nodded, because nodding was still safer than speaking, and the officer stepped out, closing the door softly behind him, and for a moment the room was quiet again. The young man's hand trembling slightly in hers, and the woman squeezed gently, reassuring him, because reassurance was what she sold, and because tonight she needed it too, and she turned her voice back to the young man, speaking softly, telling him to breathe, telling him that everything was fine, while inside her bodice the envelope rested warm against her skin, and in her mind, slow and steady, she began again to plan the moment she would slip out of this house and carry that envelope into the hall at Nochnoi Air before the officer returned with less patience than before. And as she spoke, the young man's breathing eased again, and the room's warmth settled back into its Privichny rhythm, but the corridor outside no longer felt like a Privichka, it felt like a path, and the woman, still calm, still steady, listened to the distant thunder of guns and the softer thunder of her own pulse. And she knew that the night was moving towards something it could not disguise forever, and she leaned closer to the young man, her voice low, asking him gently whether he had family in the city, whether anyone would notice if he didn't return home tonight. And he blinked, confused by the question, and then he said softly that he lived in a lodging house, that no one really watched, and the woman nodded, because that meant he was like so many others, invisible enough to disappear without a ripple. And she thought, with a tired, neutrony anger, that invisibility was the most dangerous thing you could be in a world run by men with titles. And she spoke again, softly, telling him that after tonight he should go straight home, that he should not wander, that the streets were not safe. And he nodded, believing her because her calm voice made belief easy, and as she spoke, she heard the faint sound of the front door opening again. Not a knock this time, but the quiet creak of someone slipping in, and she felt her body still for a moment, listening, and then the corridor lamps flickered, and she heard the measured footsteps again, closer than before, and she realized with a slow, hollowed clarity that the officer had not left the house at all. He had only stepped into the corridor, waiting, listening, and now he was coming back. And the woman kept her face calm, because panic would betray her faster than words. And she leaned toward the young man, her voice still soft, as she said, very simply, that he needed to stay quiet, and she rose from the chair, moving slowly toward the window, as if only adjusting the curtain, as if only tending to the room's Privichny uyud, and in that small movement she shifted her weight, preparing to move toward the vnutreny door that led to the servants' passage, a narrow way out that only the women of the house used, a way the clients rarely saw, and as she moved, the handle of the main door began to turn again, very slowly, and the woman's fingers brushed the envelope hidden against her chest. And she thought, with a tired, almost, the handle of the main door began to turn again, very slowly, and the woman's fingers brushed the envelope hidden against her chest. And she thought, with a tired, almost practiced calm, that the worst part of dealing with men like this wasn't their anger, it was their certainty, the quiet confidence that every hallway in every house eventually belonged to them, and that all a woman could do was decide which kind of damage she preferred. She kept her face smooth. She kept her voice low. She moved as if she was only adjusting a curtain, as if the air in the room was still warm and harmless, as if the night was still just another night of people buying forgetfulness, the way they bought cigarettes and whiskey and excuses. The door opened. The officer stepped in, and he didn't bother with a polite smile this time. He looked around the room with the mild irritation of a man who had been forced to acknowledge that other people had lives happening when he wasn't watching. His gaze found the young man first, sitting too still, eyes wide, hand clenched on his own knee like he was trying to hold himself together by force. Then the officer looked at the woman. He didn't ask if she was busy. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't ask anything that suggested she might be a person whose evening could be interrupted unfairly. He just said softly that he wanted to speak with her alone. The woman gave him the same calm, professional look she gave everyone, the look that said yes without promising anything, the look that kept men from feeling challenged. She turned slightly toward the young man and said, gently, that he could wait a moment, that she would return soon. The young man nodded too quickly, grateful to be told what to do, grateful that someone else seemed to know the rules of a world he had wandered into without understanding it. He looked like he wanted to disappear into the upholstery. The woman stepped toward the officer with slow, unhurried movements, because hurried movements attracted attention, and attention in rooms like this was the beginning of pain. The officer moved with her, guiding her toward the corridor, not touching her, but close enough that his authority filled the space like smoke. They stepped out into the hallway where the lamps were low and the air smelled faintly of perfume and coal dust and old wallpaper. The corridor was quiet in the way quiet things are when they're listening. Somewhere far off, a door clicked softly. Somewhere else, a floorboard sighed. The officer leaned in slightly, his voice still smooth, still careful, as if he was speaking to a servant in a palace rather than a woman in a house that made his public life possible. He said, quietly, that he had been thinking about what she might be carrying. She asked him what he meant. He smiled again, smaller now, and said he meant that the night made people forget themselves. And sometimes, when people forgot themselves, they took things they shouldn't take. Letters, names, little pieces of information that didn't belong in their hands. And then, very casually, he placed his palm on the wall beside her head, leaning his weight in, trapping her in that narrow space where the corridor suddenly felt less like a hallway and more like a throat. He said he would hate for her to misunderstand the arrangement. The woman nodded once, slow and polite, as if she was listening to a man complain about the weather, and inside her chest the envelope pressed warm against her skin, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to her. She said, softly, that she understood arrangements very well. The officer's eyes flicked downward for a moment, just a moment, and she knew he was looking for the slightest change in her breathing, the slightest shift of fabric, the smallest betrayal of where the paper was hidden. Men like him didn't need certainty. They only needed suspicion. He asked her quietly if she'd like to be searched. The woman let out a tiny breath that could have been a laugh if it had been warmer. She said, still calm, that if he searched her, he'd have to explain why he was here at all. And explaining had a way of making problems multiply in inconvenient directions. The officer stared at her for a long beat, measuring the risk, weighing his desire for control against his need for discretion. This was the strange balance that kept the whole system functioning. Men like him could do almost anything, but they couldn't do it loudly. Loudness was messy. Loudness made newspapers curious. Loudness made wives ask questions. Loudness made governments suddenly discover morals. Finally, he smiled again, a little forced. He said softly that she was clever. And then he said, just as softly, that clever women sometimes disappeared. The woman's face remained smooth because fear was not allowed to show. Not here. not to him. She answered in the same even tone that women disappeared all the time and that the world rarely noticed, which was exactly why it was such a waste to make a point out of it. The officer's smile tightened. He didn't like hearing the truth, said plainly. Powerful men seldom do. He straightened slightly, drawing back just enough to make it seem, if someone walked past, that nothing was happening, that he was simply speaking to her, that he was simply a gentleman in a corridor. He said that he would return later. He said he expected her to remember what loyalty looked like. And then he turned and walked away down the corridor, his footsteps quiet and measured, as if the house itself had been built to cushion men like him. The woman stood still for a moment, listening until the sound of his steps faded into the deeper hush of the building. The lamps hummed faintly. The air felt warmer now, but not in a comforting way. Warmer, the way a closed room feels before a storm breaks. She touched the envelope through the fabric with two fingers, barely there, like she was checking whether it was real. It was, she breathed out slowly. And then she began to walk, not back into the room with the young man, not toward the familiar routines, but toward the servants' passage at the end of the corridor, the narrow route the clients didn't use, the one that smelled of soap and damp brick and quiet exits, because if she was going to move that paper into daylight, she would have to do it before the officer decided that discretion was less important than revenge, and before the house itself became the kind of place where even the walls could be made to testify against her. And as she reached the dark doorway of the passage and slipped inside, the corridor lamps behind her casting a thin ribbon of light across the floor, she heard faintly the distant guns outside resume their slow thunder, and she thought, with the driest kind of irony, that the city could survive bombs falling from the sky. But a single name written neatly on a page might be what finally made the whole elegant machine start to choke.